But I'm still gonna unmute. It's still on mute. On the computer, it says I am.
Yeah, the computer, you're on mute.
Sababa. Okay. Okay, everyone. Good morning. Nice to be here. I'm gonna wait one more minute because it's only 8:59, and I don't wanna make anybody miss anything who doesn't need to. Okay. I do want to say, mostly it's to remind myself that in most of these classes, we have more people on Zoom than here in person. And so I have to remember to also give that place. And when someone asks a question, I need to repeat it so that they can hear it. And at the end of class, I'm also going to open it to any comments for anyone who wants on Zoom. So I will just say that as teachers, this is like the worst. Mamash. No, because like we're all together. We have, humans in front of each other. And like, this is where you're like naturally drawn as a human, but you have to remember everybody else who's not here. And that's the reason why I'll be sticking with PowerPoints also this year, because it's just easiest to be able to go back and forth between both us being here and also everybody on Zoom. Okay, just gonna see this here. Okay, we're gonna get going.
Fix the camera so we see your face when you're standing.
I understand. Yeah. Let me put the cameras up there. Hold on. I hear. 1 second. Dana, can you come here for a second to fix the camera? They can hear us. I don't want to touch it.
Another option is to sit down. She doesn't do that.
I don't sit.
Standing still is hard enough.
I love sleeping because it's the only time of the day that I become horizontal or do anything that isn't standing. It's like my favorite time of the day, which I thought she usually hear me. Let me just go get it. I don't want to touch it and get in trouble. My head's cut off. Oh, I don't have to, that moves that?
This moves that.
Oh, okay. I'll do that next time.
It's opposite though. Up is down, down is up.
That's interesting. Okay. Okay, so I just want to say for those on Zoom that I know that you can't see the PowerPoint through the video, but that's why there's on screen share. Okay, so I know that you won't be able to see it at the same time. Welcome everybody. Happy Thursday. Last week we did sort of a very formal introduction to biblical poetry, put down some of the basics of biblical parallelism and different kinds of biblical parallelism, and we'll be coming back to that. We'll be referring to those terms throughout, but we're going to now sort of jump right into the introduction to Shir Shirim. The semester will be divided into probably about 6 classes on Shir Shirim and another 6 or 7 on Tehillim, depending on how the semester falls out. And when we open up Tehillim, we'll also do an introduction to Tehillim, and that's how we'll roll. I will say that I love Shir Shirim. With all the fancy introductions last week, I can't move. Also, I'm just saying, I apologize. I'm like really a room traveler, but I have to stay here. That with all the introductions, Shir Shirim is the least formal of biblical poetry. It really is free flowing. And I will just recap for anybody who maybe wasn't here last week that biblical poetry, how it's defined, is very tricky business. And we mentioned James Fogel as sort of being on the extreme of the spectrum, although I actually this week I reread a Hebrew version of what he wrote in English literally decades earlier, and he tried to like speak more calmly, and he said, I was presented as being anti-parallelism, but it's not really true. And it was interesting to watch someone reflect on what they wrote decades earlier in a Hebrew translation of the same book. And so, but he does say that, there's a parallel, there's a continuum, and that I think is true, which is that there are poetic texts put into narrative texts, and there are also like Adam Arishon's first, exclamation to Chava of Basar Mipsari, and we'll see that pasuk toward later on in the class today. But there are also, it's difficult because we have parallelism that comes up in all different kinds of texts in Tanakh, not just poetic ones. But what we will find in a poetic text is a concentration, okay? It's a concentration of tremendous amount of imagery, parallelism that just, comes at you one pasuk after the other. And we'll find a few other phenomena that we'll talk about, but I think that the best way to describe a poetic text is by the concentration of those elements. Someone will use a metaphor in their regular daily speech, or somebody will use imagery, but in poetic text, it's just completely saturated with these kinds of ways of expression. And that is, I think, the best way to be able to go about it. What I will say is that really convincingly, what James Fogel does, again, I thought it was even better than the Hebrew one, maybe because it was just much more concise than the English, is that he takes like narrative text, like the birth of Moshe, and he says you can break down the entire section of the second paragraph of Shemot into half lines. And it's true. So there also is a matter of ways of expression that are used in Tanakh. But when we're talking about poetic texts, we're talking about texts that have a real concentration, a real mass of these kinds of phenomena. Okay, so that's yes.
Can you give a citation for this writing?
Yeah, so I brought it in last week. It was in the slides last week. So James Fogel, the book that came out decades ago in the 80s was is something to the effect of the art of biblical parallelism. If you look up Fogel biblical parallelism, that's what will come up. But the Hebrew version that I read this week was in a book that's open on my own laptop, which was you want the Hebrew one also?
Yes.
I'm happy to send it.
You don't have to do it right
I'll give it to you right after. It's open on my computer. It's a great book. That's a collection of introductory essays to all different forms of biblical writing. It's an excellent book. I was exposed to this week because I'm in the middle of researching Tehillim for a different project, so I came up against it. Okay, so one other word of introduction is that when I teach Shirim, which I taught you years ago, but it's going to be very different. Nachon, literally Nachon. So years ago, it's my first time in literally 11 years I've ever even thought to teach something that's minor related to something I taught in the past. But I teach it with a lot of songs. So in today also we have 2 songs, because one of the things that interests me the most is how modern, sometimes not so modern artists utilize words from Shir Shirim in all different ways. So every class will have at least one song that integrates the words, and sometimes we'll look deeper at the words and how they play with them, and sometimes we'll just enjoy the music. Okay, so without further ado, does everyone get the reference in the title? Hold on. Okay. So let's talk about Shir Shirim. Bemet Shir Shirim seems to have no place in Tanakh. It is a book at first glance, and at second glance, and at third glance, of secular love poetry. There is nothing in Shir Shirim that suggests anything religious about it. It's extremely erotic, with open references. Good morning, to all different body parts, male and female. There's a tremendous emphasis also on physical beauty, meaning it's not just that they talk about each other's body, but that it really sort of takes center stage in much of the poetry. And while as Megillat Esther gets all the press for not having God in it, neither does Shir Shirim. There obviously it's more overt because it's also a story about salvation, and it's a story that's much more theologic. But also in Shir Shirim we don't have God anywhere. We have the Melech, but the king, is just a figure in the backdrop. So Shir Shirim seems to really have no place in the canon. How did it get in there at all? Okay. So here, I want to bring us a few sources that reflect the discomfort that Chazal had throughout the ages with Shir Shirim being placed in Tanakh. Now, I do want to say, and this I didn't bring a source for, which is that Shir Shirim is considered to be of the books of Shlomo. I can't do both at the same time. So, taking another class to get used to this hyper situation. Yeah, I can't write, but the books of Shlomo, Mishlei, Kohelet, and Shir Shirim. Okay, those are essentially understood to be Shlomo's works. I'm looking at the source that you see in front of you. כל כתבי הקודש טמאים את הידיים, שיר השירים וקהלת מטמאים את הידיים. רבי יהודה אומר, שיר השירים מטמא את הידיים וקהלת מחלוקת. רבי יוסי אומר, קהלת אינה מטמא את הידיים ושיר השירים מחלוקת. רבי שמעון אומר, קהלת מכולי בית שמאי ומחומרי בית הלל. So before we get to this machloket, which we see surrounds, I'll translate everything, don't worry. The machloket surrounds Shir Shirim and Kohelet. This phrase of that it is metamet yadayim, that your hands are impurified, requires some explanation. It's a code word for that it's a Kodesh book, okay? Meaning the phrase means that it's the book itself is holy, but why is something that's holy considered to also make someone's hands impure? And that's because of some of the following fact, which is that they would keep truma fruits, okay, and foods, fruits and vegetables inside the same cabinets as Sifrei Kodesh, which were written on parchments, and it would cause them trouble because essentially often rodents would be attracted to the foods that were in there, and sometimes the fruits and vegetables would become tmeim. They would become impure because of the animals, and they would also render the scrolls that were in the same cabinets impure. So they were trying to keep all the pure things together, and essentially it would get them into trouble because the food attracted rodents, and so it would render them impure. And so there was a gzeira that was made that that any time you touch these books, you also wouldn't be able to touch the food in case you were passing the tum'ah from the scrolls onto the food itself. Okay, so that's why this phrase means that it's a holy book, because it means that it's holy enough that they're going to put it away in the cabinet so that it won't get impurified. Okay, so that's just explanation about what that phrase means. Anyone have any questions? We're good. Okay. And so there's this machloket, is Shir Shirim really a book that's kadosh? Is Kohelet, okay, why would Kohelet, by the way, why is it a questionable book? What? Everything is Hevel. God gets in there a few times, but it's also a book that has a lot of internal contradiction, has a lot of sentences, a lot of psukim and Kohelet that don't necessarily seem to sort of jive with or more familiar with from biblical perspectives. It's not for like the theologically wary. Okay, it's a book that is also much more complex. And I'm continuing in the source. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Azai Mikubal Ani. Wait, I'm blocking. Can you guys see it if I stand there? Not so much, right? But if I stand here, they can't see me. Give me a second. Let me think of a good solution. If I move this, no, the camera's there. Anyone have an idea for me? I want to be able to see it. I can't. What? You're okay? Okay. אמר רבי שמעון בן עזאי, מקובל מפי 72 זקנים, ביום שהושיבו את רבי אלעזר בן עזריה בישיבה, ששיר השירים וקהלת מטמאים את הידיים. Okay, that we have here a Masorah that clearly in the time of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Shir Hashirim Kohelet were considered to be holy books. They had made it fully in the canon. Now, I do want to say that the question of when did Tanakh become the canon that's closed the way it looks today is a very largely unsolved academic question. Certainly by the time of later Bayit Sheni, the canon was closed, okay? We don't know exactly when. Different dates have been suggested by different academics, but we look at Tanakh as being, it's very clear, there's a book, it has a beginning, it has an ending, but that concept historically was much more complex about how books took its form. We also know that there are many other books that were written in very biblical style that don't make it in, and they're considered to be the Apocrypha, right? It's similar to Braitot. They're the loser books, right? The books that didn't make it in, just like the Braitot or the Mishnayot that didn't make it in. And so this process is attested to in some of these sources, meaning we get a sense of it that, okay, well, there were books that even when they were considered to be in, still for a number of centuries were books that we weren't sure that we really wanted to keep them in there. And like a lot of things in our religious life, it's a matter of time that even practices that we think, oh, well, those aren't religious practices, or today we would say they're not orthodox practices, only over the span of time can we attest to whether or not they are orthodox or not. And this is a sentence that I take from one of the rabbanim who taught me in Stern a million years ago, Rabbi Saul Berman, and he basically said that it's a test of time. He said, if it stays in and part of the religious world, then you know that it's an Orthodox practice. And so I would say something pretty similar about also books of Tanakh that were sort of on the border, right? I'm not talking about Torah or Sefer Shmuel or Melachim. I'm talking about Ketuvim and other books like Sefer Yehudit or Sefer Yovlim, right? Jubilees or Judith, or Sefer Chanoch. All these books that maybe we've heard of a little bit, but they're in the Latin Bible, they're in the Vulgate. Christians read them, but they're not in our Tanakh. And so there's all these books that were sort of debated over time, and ultimately time decided. Okay, there was it seems some official enactments like we're seeing in sources like this, and there also are these books that were received and that were accepted by the Jewish people. And so many of them were not, and they remained outside of the canon. There is an academic opinion that thinks that there was like an official conference in Yavne at a certain point, but there's not such great proof for it. But they believe that there was some sort of like official conference that gave stamps of approval to certain books, and certain ones they didn't, but we don't really have such great proof for that in our sources, for sure not. Okay, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Okay, and now again, when Rabbi Akiva is talking, I want to make it clear, he's not actually having a conversation whether or not Shir Shirim is making it into Tanakh. Shir Shirim has already made it into Tanakh by the time Rabbi Akiva is speaking. But in Rabbi Akiva's generation, he feels a need to defend its place in the canon. אמר רבי עקיבא, חס ושלום, לא נחלק אדם מישראל בשיר השירים שלא תטמא את הידיים, שאין העולם כולו כדאי ביום שניתנה בו שיר השירים בישראל, שכל הכתובים קודש ושיר השירים קודש קודשים. ואם נחלקו, לא נחלקו אלא על קהלת. Okay, and Rabbi Akiva says, Ma pitom, okay, there were not this discussion, this debate about Sifrei Shlomo is not really focused on Shir Shirim. If anything, it's about Kohelet, because Shir Shirim is the most holy of books. Now, I will just say that Rabbi Akiva, being Mr. Proponent of Shir Shirim, is also interesting. Looking at the stories we know about Rabbi Akiva, who on one hand, leaves his wife for very long periods of time, but we also have, one of the few, really heart-pulling descriptions of relationships. We also have with Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel. So it's interesting that Rabbi Akiva is associated with this idea that Shir Shirim is the holiest of books. I'm going to move for a second. Sorry for the zoomers, just so that everyone can see it. Just here, I see people are struggling to see. And so it's interesting that Rabbi Akiva is the full defendant of Shir Shirim. But he says that it's a book that's Kodesh. We still have to ask, how is it Kodesh if in fact it's a book that's talking about this very young, impressionable relationship between a man and a woman that largely talks about their body parts in at least 40% of the book. Okay, I'm going to stop here for now, and any questions? Always feel free to just jump into the middle. Okay. Okay, two other sources that I think are also important to see. We're familiar with the first one. Havu metunim badin. Okay, here is Avot Rabbi Natan, which is a commentary on Pirkei Avot. Ketzad melamed sheyehei adam mamtin badin, shekol hamamtin badin miyushav badin, שנאמר גם אלה משלי שלמה אשר העתיקו אנשי חזקיהו מלך יהודה, ולא שהעתיקו אלא שהמתינו. And here is a fascinating comment that also sort of undercuts this idea of like how books make it in, the fact that they get edited also, which is a word that we don't have to be scared of necessarily. It takes the phrase havu matunim badin, and it says, what does it mean to be matun? In modern Hebrew, matun means moderate. Okay, it's a word to mean someone is matun, they're moderate. And here it says matun from, I really want to write in the board. Matun from lehamtin. It's also a bad marker. Lehamtin is to wait. Okay, and it says, the Perush says that we need to be miyushav badin, that you have to, in order to come to a good decision, you have to wait. You have to let it sit with you. You have to let it mature, which is how the word then eventually becomes moderate. In general, by the way, words always go from concrete meaning to metaphoric or abstract meaning. So the mitunim is that they were mamtin, they were sitting, they were waiting with it. And eventually it came to mean to be moderate, because someone who's moderate, right, they wait, they think before they speak. And so what does this have to do with Shir Shirim? That it says, what does it mean, shehimtinu, that they waited, okay? And that this is what we're talking about with Mishlei of Shlomo, that they copied them and they waited with them, meaning they let it sit to see what would happen with this book. We're going to let it hang around to see how do people receive it. And then later on, Abba Shaul Omer Lo Shehimtinu Ela Shepirshu. It's not that they waited around with Shir Shirim, but that they had to reinterpret it. It wasn't just like, let's let Shir Shirim, this work that we have that's traditionally written by Shlomo. And so eventually we'll, discover how much it really is connected to our theological relationship with God, which is the point of Tanakh, right? It's not just a stam collection of works, but it has to have theological basis. They say, no, it's not that we just let it sit around, but that it had to be reinterpreted. We had to do we had to do something active to make this book fit into how we think Tanakh should look. בראשונה היו אומרים, משלי ושיר השירים וקהלת יגנזו, שהם היו אומרים משלות ואינם מן הכתובים. ועמדו וגנזו אותם עד שבאו אנשי כנסת הגדולה ופרשו אותם. And so again, here we have another witness to this idea that these three books were we weren't sure what to do with them. Also, Mishlei is, I would say in many places, it feels like a little bit of a secular book of just, nice ideas. Again, God is totally present in Mishlei, but there are also elements of Mishlei that Chazal had issues with. And so this Avot Rabbi Natan, which again is a very, very early Tanaitic Perush, basically says that these three books, originally they said, we'll just put them away. Like they don't really have a place in Tanakh. Yignazu, milashon gniza. We're going to put them away for now because they don't fit into how we want Tanakh to look. But then Ad Shebao Anshe Knesset Hagdola, and they reinterpreted them. Okay, so we let Shir Shirim, which is our focus for now, we let it in because it was re-explained. And that's what we're more familiar with often than the actual words themselves. I'll talk about that in a minute. Rabbi Akiva, another important source regarding Shir HaShirim, he says, Rabbi Akiva omer, hamena'aneh kolo b'shir HaShirim b'veit hamishteh ve'oseh oto k'min zemer en lo chelek la'olam haba. And he says, we're going to let Shir HaShirim in. It's such an important book, and we'll see why Chazal thought it was important. But I want to make sure that no one thinks that they can use this and just sing it as a nice song. I would say also to use it as a love song. Okay, so I want to just give an example of what Rabbi Akiva meant. See if it'll work here. No, 1 second. Hold on 1 second. 1 second. I have to share it differently, and I have to allow screen share with audio. 1 second. Okay. See if it'll work now. It'll work now. Why am I hearing myself twice? Why am I hearing myself twice? Yardena, can you come here? Yardena, can you come here? I want to play a clip and I hear myself twice. Look, if I click here and then advanced, it says share sound, but I don't know why.
You shared.
Oh, I do know why. 1 second. I know why. It needs to be enabled. 1 second.
It's enabled.
It's enabled. I just did it last night to make sure that it worked.
Now, if you put it on big.
Oh, still don't know what I mean.
Yeah.
That's very weird. I just did it last night. Hold on. But I'm not on. Okay, I'll just look at it right now. Am I still they seeing me right now? No. No, I'm saying they're not seeing this. There's no video. It doesn't matter that they don't see it. But is Zoom still, it's still on, right?
Yeah.
They don't need to see the screen right now. That's that. Oh, but then it doesn't really matter. So- Of what, Rabbi? Sada?
במיטתי כבר שבועות ביקשתי את שאהבה נפשי ולא מצאתי חיפשתי בין כל רחובות העיר העמוס השקרים הזאת ולא מצאתי בצעוניה שומרים הסובבים בעיר החובי כמעט ולא מצאתי אותו אך לא הרבה ממנו עד שאביו אל תוך עירי אל בית אמי ואל חדרי אל מיטתי הנך יפה ראיתי ושפתותייך חודשני שינייך לבנות כמו אור הלבנה מי זאת עולה מן המדבר מארץ רחוקה נישאת על כנף ציפור גדולה הגיעה לביתי
Okay. You all still hear me twice, right? Okay, so that's what Keith is talking about. Okay, he doesn't want this. I'm gonna make using media.
Now try.
Okay. Should I talk again? See. Okay. It's weird. So that's what Rabbi Kiva is, right? We don't want to take Great, awesome. Song that to listen to and without having deeper meaning to it. Okay, so what can it be? So there are two options that you're standing in front of us. One is what do you say?
I felt like, remember when on our flight, when we landed, there was like a boom, so that's where I felt. Yeah. That's exactly what happened with the shirt.
Hello, everyone. It's Yosefa.
Slowly, very slowly.
That's fine. Someone there is not on mute, but yeah. Okay, so we have two options in front of us. We have, is this a love story slash, a poetic love story, or perhaps it is meant to be an allegory, which is obviously how we're familiar with Chazal reinterpret Shir Shirim. Before we're familiar with, right? We're familiar with the dod and the ra'aya, and depending on who's reinterpreting, it will change whether or not the dod or the ra'aya is the man or the woman. In the classic allegory that maybe we're more familiar with, the dod is Hashem and the ra'aya is Am Yisrael. But in all Kabbalistic reinterpretations of Shir Shirim, it's the opposite, because they look at the Shekhinah as God and the Shekhinah as feminine. So they look at the Ra'aya as God and the Dod as Am Yisrael. And we'll talk about that as we go along, the different versions of the allegory. But I want to take a step back for a moment and look at why Chazal. I'm happy you can ask a question here, Kif. Questions? Oh, okay. But there is a deep reason why Chazal go for this metaphor. Meaning it's not just like, well, we have this book that doesn't really fit, so let's try and fit our worldview into the book. There's actually, I think, a much more deep-rooted reason why Chazal go for this. Yeah.
Was it like historically what was going on that like you were reverting to like the poetic, like the romantic, like writing all these things, and it was like a
new thing developing, and then Chazal to like totally go the opposite direction because they like to combat that, like what was going on like in the secular world around them, so to speak.
Okay, wait. So first I have to just repeat the question so that people can hear it on Zoom. But the question was, did Chazal have to reinterpret it because they were going against what was happening in the broader world around them? But I don't totally understand the question, because if the book is written, let's say by Shlomo or somewhere in the biblical period, what do you mean by the secular world around them? It's not
Meaning,
necessarily.
Not that like they interpreted for that, but I'm saying like, wasn't it like in response to, or didn't it like influence?
So it's possible that, why does Rabbi Akiva say that they shouldn't use Shir Shirim in Beit Mishtet? Because they were using Shir Shirim in Beit Mishtet. They were utilizing the words in frivolous settings. It could be, but we don't know that to be the case. Meaning, it's very obvious that a book like Shir Shirim can be used, right, in all the contexts that it often is used, as wedding songs or whatever it is. But we don't know in any surefire way that it was being misused in the broader world. It's just that it in and of itself, the content is not theological. And so that presents a problem for Chazal. Okay, so why did they go for this metaphor? Why does that become the prism that, so obviously, okay, it needs to be a theological prism because that's the point of Tanakh. But I think that there's something that's much deeper than this. And there's two sides. One is that, on one hand, looking at Shir Shirim as the love poem anthology that it clearly is on one level of it, I don't think is so crazy, okay, within the scheme of biblical writing. Okay, I've only brought you here the first poem ever, the first poetic sentence ever said in all of Tanakh, which is not coincidentally a very which is man's expression of his physical, sexual connection to the woman that was just created. Zot hapam etzem me'atzamai uvasar mibsari, zot yikare isha ki me'ish lukacha zot. Now, this first romantic expression of a man to a woman in the beginning of Sefer Breshit is not about the egalitarian nature of their relationship. It's not about how much he loves her personality. This first sentence uttered by Adam Harishon is both on one hand his exclamation of, I can't believe that I've found this person. It's that moment, right? It's the complete love moment where we feel that we're two halves of the same whole, which later the Greeks try and bring into fashion. We're two halves of the same whole. Obviously, she physically is being presented in Sefer Breshit as being made from Adam, but I want us to note that Adam speaks solely in the first person. He's speaking about his perspective. She is mine. She was made from me. And it's also, I think, very properly reflective of how people initially fall in love with each other, is very much this feeling of we're part of the same, we're two halves of the same whole. And it also initially, and we're like embarrassed almost to admit it, but it fulfills a selfish need that we have, both for sexual fulfillment and to have somebody be with us, to be in that partnership with us. I'm emphasizing again, Adam Rishon, his first moment that he speaks to the Isha is not to say, what a wonderful person you are, and your personality is just breathtaking, right? That is not what he says to her. It's expressing something much more human, much more intuitive, and much more primal of, we are of the same flesh. There's a need that is fulfilled here to both have a partner to fulfill my needs of being lonely, of lo tov adam liot levado, and also to fulfill my sexual needs. Later, the partnership will come, but that is not the initial piece that he is offering her in this poem. I will say that what I just said is inspired by, if anyone's never read it, I'm teaching Breshit in a different context this year. And every time I teach something, even if I've taught it before, I always try and read something that I haven't read before. So I'm really enjoying, it's not always simple, but I'm really enjoying Leon Kass's commentary on Sefer Breshit. It's called The Beginning of Desire. Leon Kass, I would write on the board, but I can't. It's called The Beginning of Desire. And it's a more philosophical reading of Sefer Breshit. He's just it was written years ago, decades ago, but it's really excellent. And he really pointed out what I just said right now. I was reading it the other day. So our first opening of man and woman is very much their instinctual, physical, we are connected to each other aspect of their relationship. Don't worry, they'll get to fight later in two prakim later. And that is our first prism. And there's place for love in Tanakh. We have, the relationships between the Avot and the Imahot, which again, all of them are different, and some of them are more dysfunctional than others. But we do have a place for love relationships. However, I'm going to come back to the Rambam after. I don't really want him here. I want him after. We also have some deep roots of comparing God to a love relationship in many places in Tanakh. And this sort of, jumps back also to one of my favorite topics, which is different metaphors we use for our relationship with God. And the calling our relationship with God a relationship of a brit, of a covenant, is putting us in the sphere of partners. I'm not saying that it's a love relationship, but it's putting us in the sphere of partners. Our relationship with God is called a brit, it's called a covenant all over Tanakh. And also using the word zana, okay, using the word to harlot in the terrible English translation, right? To harlot after other gods. The word zana and bagadatem bi, you betrayed me. That these words that we use to describe our relationship with God undercut the fact that our relationship with God is often compared to a love relationship, okay? And it's everywhere. It's all over the Torah, even without these kinds of psukim that we have only later in the Nevi'im of הלוך וקראת באוזני ירושלים, זכרתי לך חסד נעורייך, אהבת כלולותייך, לכתך אחריי במדבר, בארץ לא זרועה. And here Yirmiyahu was reminiscing with Am Yisrael, much later, obviously closer to the time of the Churban, of the first destruction, that God is reminding us that we were once, young lovers. We were once young lovers who went after God as blindly as lovers go after each other when they're all in their oxytocin high, right? So I teach kalot. I see this high in my face on a regular basis, some more than others, of course. And so he says that, remember that period of time that the wilderness period, the period of the desert, is being presented very idyllic, and obviously in the Torah, a little bit less so sometimes, right? But it's okay. Hundreds of years later, we can look at the wilderness period as a period that was very idyllic. We were totally dependent on God, and He had to provide for all of our needs. And לאמור הן ישלח איש את אשתו והלכה מאיתו והייתה לאיש אחר הישוב אליה עוד הלא חנוף תחנף הארץ ההיא ועד זנית רעים רבים ושוב אלי נאום השם. And here we have all the same words that I just was describing before. And here it's describing, right, would a man send away his wife, and if she has a physical relationship with another man, can she come back to him again? Halachically, it's a problem, obviously, but here it's speaking more metaphorically, right? Us who have basically worshipped other gods, can we ever really come back to God? And here again, very overtly referring to our relationship with God as a relationship between spouses. Now, what I will say is that which is, I'll say two things. One is a totally tangential point, but I'm going to bring it in because I like it, which is that we often talk about our relationship with halacha, which is very different than a relationship with God. I am separating those, but we talk about it in the terms of muchuyavut, that we're obligated to God. And the term muchuyavut, or obligation, which is far less popular and people like it a lot less in our generation, is a phrase that it belongs much more to the semantic world of father and son, or parent and child. And actually, Rav Amital, who was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, he writes in one of his books that he really suggests using the phrase ne'emanut. He says that the word ne'emanut, which means loyalty. And he says that when you speak about your relationship, here he's speaking specifically about halacha, but I think it works also theologically and certainly also halachically. That when you speak about relationship with halacha as that we're obligated, so for those who like listening to rules, it works well. And for many of us who don't, it feels much heavier. But when you look at your relationship with God as a brit, as a covenant, and then you look at your relationship to fulfillment of halacha as ne'emanut, right? I give to my spouse because I love him. It's not because every day I'm checking, give me chadash, I wake up in the morning and say, how's this going for me? Do I really want to be married to him? Right? If we would if we would scrutinize our relationships every single day anew, we all know that we would get lost and we would lose ourselves in that. It's not healthy to constantly reassess that relationship, although people for some reason like to do this with God all the time, right? Like constantly reassessing whether or not I'm in this and obligated. But I again often teach, I largely teach younger women in their 20s. So this is something that very much resonates with them. And he says that we look at it as nemanut, as loyalty. Because I am loyal to my spouse and in a relationship with them, I do all sorts of things that I don't necessarily love all the time. I don't necessarily feel good about them all the time, but I do them because I'm engaged and dedicated to this relationship. And so I love that. It's a little semantic twist, but I think that it offers like a much broader window into the way our hearts and souls can sort of adjust in that kind of relationship. And so I'll just take another example from Hosea. Again, also psukim that are yachasit. That just moved, or that was just me? Okay. Of course, I can't see them here because this Zoom is covering it also here. והרסתיך לי לעולם, והרסתיך לי שנייה. חסד וברחמים. Here we go. וביום ההוא נאום אדוני, תקראי אישי ולא תקראי לי עוד בעלי. There's always a question here. Is it supposed to be a play on words with Baal as the name of the other gods? But here it's saying you will call me your ish and not your Baal, meaning it's a relationship of equals as opposed to a relationship of a hierarchy. In modern Hebrew, it's always a question, do women still call their spouses Baal or they say ish? והסירותי את שמות הבעלים מפיה ולא יזכרו עוד בשמם, right? And God says, I will remove, and this day when our relationship was renewed, I'm going to remove the names of the Baal, which is again a play on words of the name of the actual Canaanite god, Baal, the god of fertility, from your lips, but it also is a play on words with the fact that you've engaged in relationships, you are married, you are in relationships with other gods. And God says, I will remove those words from your lips. וחרתי להם ברית ביום ההוא עם חיית השדה ועם עוף השמיים וכולי וכולי, והרסתיך לי לעולם, פסוק כ"א, והרסתיך לי בצדק ובמשפט ובחסד וברחמים. Okay, and I will become betrothed to you through the mitzvot, through tzedek u'mishpat. Okay, and so we have all over. It's everywhere. When you start looking for it, you cannot see it. The idea that our relationship with God is compared to a relationship between spouses. And so to come back, I want to move this 1 second. To come back to Shir HaShirim. Okay, to come back to Shir HaShirim is that Chazal reinterpret Shir HaShirim to be allegory, right? It can't be that we're just going to let a secular book of love poems, even if it was written by Shlomo, just sit there idly in Tanakh. It just doesn't work. It's not the thrust of how we want the book to be. What I will say is that in terms of how I teach it, is that I actually, I want to go back to the Rambam, is that I teach it in combination. I focus more on the words and on the, as we'll see, the poetic aspects of it, because I think that you can't get to the allegory without really getting first the depth of what the actual psukim are saying. We will bring in the allegory, but I really believe that the allegory has its value for what you can take with the emotion that's created from the actual love poems and then transplant them into a relationship with God, everyone in their own form and in their own amount. And so I really will spend more of our efforts on the psukim. I will bring in some of the really canonical midrashim that I think that we need to know if we're reading Shir HaShirim, but that will be sort of towards the end of class. Okay, most of it will be really focusing on the words and understanding the main themes in Shir HaShirim, and that's very significant. And I just want to, before we move on to already getting into the psukim, just want to go back to the Rambam and I don't see myself. I hope they could see me. The Rambam says in Hilchot Shuvah, "V'cheitzad hi ahava reuya." Here he's talking about ahavat Hashem, right? How should we love God, right? In that dichotomy between ahava v'yirah and fear or awe. הוא שיאהב את השם אהבה גדולה יתרה רבה, עזה עד מאוד, עד שתהיה נפשו קשורה באהבת השם. ונמצא שוגה בה תמיד, כאילו חולה אהבה, שאין דעתם פנויה מאהבת אותה אישה שהוא שוגה בה תמיד. And he says we should be obsessed with God, right? That oxytocin high, he says we want that in our relationship with God. Just like when we meet somebody and we fall in love with them, all we could do is think about them. We can't think about anybody else and anything else. He says that's how we want to be in our relationship with God. We want to be just completely and utterly lovesick. I will say as a sidebar, that if anyone is interested in this kind of work, Helen Fisher is a really fascinating woman who studies the biology of love and falling of love. She has a book, I think it's called The Anatomy of Love, where she spent years putting people who were like in the early stages of relationship under fMRIs and looking at what parts of their brain literally don't function when they are so filled with oxytocin and other love hormones. So that's the love sick. You're literally sick. Your brain is not functioning. Yeah.
But is it like?
It's a great thing. We should all experience it and then move on. Yeah.
God is supposed to be something that's like everlasting and continuous. and
Great.
Daily, like, and people don't stay in that for stage of
Yefe. So remind me your name.
Ellie.
Ellie. So Ellie is saying, but that's not realistic. People don't stay in that stage. Let me finish it and then I want to get to that exact point. שהוא שוגה בתמיד, בין בשוכבו, בין בקומו, בין בשעה שהוא אוכל ושותה, you can't do anything, you can't eat, sleep, or drink, יתר מזה שתהיה אהבת השם בלב אוהביו, ושוגים בה תמיד, כמו שציוונו בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך. And it brings from Shema, that that's what it means by your whole heart, that you have no room for anything else. והוא ששלמה אומר דרך משל, כי יכולת אהבה אני. וכל שיר השירים משל הוא לעניין זה. Okay, I'm going to swing back to your point, Ellie, in a second. But he says that, what is shir hashirim? The whole shir hashirim is describing a very early, immature relationship between a young man and a woman. And he says that this whole book is a metaphor for this idea of how we should be falling in love with God. Now, Ellie makes a great point and says, it's not even realistic. And I've already suggested, I don't even think we really want that, right? How is that realistic? It's the early, I would even say it's a stage of Ba'alat Tshuva, or it's a stage of a young person in Midrashah and just, you taking it all in. And there are moments in life where some of us may experience that kind of that love sickness in our relationship with God, but it's certainly not something that we can propel and maintain for long periods of time. And I don't know if it's something that we want to, right? So it's a question of how to take the Rambam here. So I think that the Rambam is sort of setting up in an idea, right? It's a certain idea. It's an ideal that maybe we want to experience that, right? I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a student this week who was mamash speaking about this Rambam without knowing. And she was saying that when she was in high school, she, was exposed to learning and she was like literally mamash, like lovesick for learning. And she said, and now and it was also different because she was in a place where, people weren't as engaged religiously. And there was also obviously something exciting. That's like part of like the romance of like you're doing something that's different from other people. And now she's, sitting for a year and learning in Midrashah. And she's like, it's kind of regular. And she's like, I don't know, is that okay? I'm feeling like a little sad that I'm not like totally excited, that it's just what I do when I wake up in the morning. And I said, and it was so funny because she was coming at it from the religious part and I was giving her the metaphors in a romantic relationship. And I said to her, I said, what happens though over time is that there's something very exciting. And again, I want to emphasize, and obviously not all couples or not both spouses necessarily go through that falling in love stage. That's another struggle when people, decide they want to get married, but they feel like they have this pressure to be Disney. And like, I don't really feel Disney, but I think we want to get married. And I'm like, that's okay also, But I said to her, I said, the thing is that over time, a relationship that's persisted and gone through difficulties over a decade or 2 decades sometimes it's not as exciting in that early way as a relationship that's developed, which obviously many of you here know this much better than I do, have more than 10 years under their belt. But it's much deeper and you've already sort of pushed your way through so many other walls and so many other stages that it's a relationship that is not lovesick, but it's a much deeper place to be in. And I was relating it back to the world of learning and we were talking about that, but I think that I would agree with you that the Rambam here is not my ideal. But what he's saying is that it is nice to have that stage at some point, meaning it is nice. What's the purpose, by the way? What's the purpose of falling in love? This is, again, I'm going back to Helen Fisher. Why are we wired this way? It's that people will want to do the most ridiculous thing and commit themselves to one person, right? You need that jump, she says, from an evolutionary biologist perspective, so that you'll do something irrational, like commit to one person and then like have children with them. And so that's from an evolutionary biologist perspective. But I think that there's an import for that also in a religious relationship. There's a reason why people send their kids to study for a year or 2 years or 3 years, right? Meaning we want to like hook them in. We want to get them, we want them to always be able to go back and remember that time. Because when things are a little bit less sparkly and things are a little bit less exciting, that they can remember that why they got into that situation in the first place. Of course, we know, and that's why you're all here, is to continue the relationship, right? You don't want to just rely on what happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but you want to continue the relationship. So I think that the Rambam is a point on the continuum. I don't think that that's the only place we need to be, but he says, if you look at Sefer Shir Shirim, it's a young love relationship. And I will say that this idea gets reflected in the machloket among Chazal of when did Shlomo write Shir Shirim? Was it his first book or was it his third book? And so everything I've said now makes sense that it should be his first book, okay? But another opinion in the Midrash is that it's his third book, Dafka, because he went through a lot of rough patches in his life. Many of us remember his biography from Sefer Melachim, and only later in life, after he got over the hurdle of the foreign women and all their gods, was he able to sort of come back to God and be in a relationship with God from a pure, excited place. So it's a machloke, but I definitely think that from the thrust of things here, it definitely feels like it would be his earlier book. But okay. Another important question that anyone coming to study Shir Shirim has to ask themselves. Yes, please. Just tell me your name. Did you have Gabi?
I just have a question on the Rambam.
Yeah.
Is it possible to like understand it as something that could like manifest, like the words of the Rambam uses can manifest differently depending on the stage? Like it doesn't necessarily, or is it like inherently in the words the Rambam uses, it's talking about this like young whatever thing of love, or could it be that like if you're, you could be thinking of somebody constantly, but it could be, let's say, in a more like mature and like developed way.
Look, people fall in love at all different stages of life. It's not necessarily a matter of how old they are.
Right,
But,
I'm saying even
yeah.
the nature of what the Rambam's talking about, is it possible that it could be something sustainable, but it will look different depending on the stage of your relationship with God?
I think that's an important additional sentence, but I don't think that's what the Rambam says.
But
I think
was
he's,
asking,
yeah, I think that's,
he's referring to like inherently.
yeah,
that
he's
is-
referring to a lovesick stage. Now, the Rambam living in time, I don't know how much was familiar with people falling in love later in life or additional marriages or, a different world that he was living in. I think people were lucky then if their wife lived past, their childbirth. But I'm, by the way, reading a biography right now of Benjamin Franklin, and it's crazy. People often were married to 4 women because their wives just kept dying. I was just thinking about that. It's really crazy in the 1600s in America. It was like the average person had 3 or 4 wives because the men lived much longer and they would die in childbirth. Anyways, fascinating piece of information. Obviously horrible, and so thankful I live in today's world and not 400 years ago. But yeah, I don't think the Rambam says that, but I think that there's a truth to what you're saying. Okay, so last technical question before we jump in, which is that when anybody reads Shir Shirim, when you open your Tanakh in front of you, it looks like a big blob, right, of words. It's not set up poetically. You'll see every time we have class, I'm going to set it up poetically on here because we just miss so much if we just read it straightforward. We miss all the parallelism and all the poetry of the psukim, and it also is formed in one book, right? It's all there. But when you read deeper in Shir Shirim, you see very clearly that there are different poems. And they are separated, and there's a tremendous amount of debate between Parshanim and scholars where poems should be divided up, and it makes tremendous difference in their meaning. But that is one of the basic exegetical questions that you have to ask when you open up Shir Shirim. And I will say that the way that I will be teaching is that they are definitely separate poems. I don't believe that there is a narrative flow between them. And this is a difference between what I once thought to what I think today. I do not think that there's a narrative flow between them, but there are thematic connections between different poems, and that we will address. There are characters that appear and reappear, but there may be a little bit of movement, meaning there are some poems that reflect more of a closeness and others that reflect more of a distance between the lovers, but it's not a flowing narrative. Now, there are those out there who will explain it as some sort of flowing narrative. Or that there is, again, the better word is movement. It's not a book, it's not a story, it's not a biblical narrative, but that there is a clear development. Just some examples, Eliyahu Assis was also my advisor for my doctorate, Professor Eliyahu Assis. So he has a book on Shir Shirim, and he definitely supports more of this idea that there is a certain flow between the poems. Rav Sherlow also has a commentary on Shir Shirim, and he also supports that idea to a certain degree. I really think that it forces us to sort of jump through all different hoops to make things connected when they're really not necessarily connected. And so we'll look at things a little bit more thematically. But for example, there will be a general theme of the threatening background male character that comes up in many places throughout, and it reflects the young woman's relationship with the men around her, for example. So there are themes that will come up. Okay, let's jump right in. Oh, I see, it's a delay on the screen. Okay. Shir HaShirim Asher LeShlomo. Okay, how do we understand? This is what we call a koteret. It's a headline. It's not inherently connected with the words that come after it. We have it all the time in Sefer Tehillim. Most Pirkei Tehillim open with the koteret, with some sort of opening line. Last night, I'm learning Tehillim with one of my daughters, and last night we opened up, I think it's Yud, Perek Yud or Yud Aleph, and there was no koteret, and all of a sudden I was like thrown off. I was like, wait a second, it's connected to the first one. So usually there is a koteret that it sort of maps us out. Where are we supposed to be? And what is the phrase Shir HaShirim Asher LeShlomo? How do we understand it? How do you understand this phrase? What?
Title and author.
I can't. I'm not understanding.
Title and author.
Title and author. What does it mean? Shir HaShirim. The most exalted. So it's the best one. Okay, it's the best one of all of Shlomo's songs. So another option is it's a song from the songs that he wrote, meaning it's not necessarily the best one, but it's a selection, right? It's a selection of Shlomo's works. What's another interpretation on the more metaphorical line that maybe we're familiar with? Is that Shlomo is, according to the Midrash, is God, right? That again, already right off the bat, interpreting this metaphorically through the allegory, and the allegory often will take. Shlomo is mentioned about 3 times throughout Shir Shirim. He's not a character in Shir Shirim. He just jumps in and out a little bit. And there's a few places where we have the Melech, and we'll contend with the ideas: is the Melech Shlomo? Is it somebody else? Is it some other character? But the Midrash says that Shlomo here is God. Okay, and so these are the songs that were written for God. Okay, and so they're already right off the bat reinterpreting all this to be speaking about God. I will just say that Shlomo is a fitting author for Shir Shirim, of course, because Shlomo, as we know, had many wives. He loved many women. It led him in the end of his life to an unfortunate place. But on the non-metaphoric level, on just the Shlomo writing love poetry, okay, that is not such a crazy idea. And we know from Sefer Melachim that he has many mishalim, that he writes many parables, and he also has alfei shirim. He writes thousands of poems. Okay, so that the shayachut, the connection between Shlomo and Shir Shirim is something that certainly on the non-metaphoric level fits in very well with the psukim and also with his personal life. Okay, I want us to end for today by looking at Rashi's introduction to Shir Shirim. Now, I want to look at it because it sort of rounds out this idea of the allegory and shows us how dynamic the allegory actually is. as I said earlier, depending on who you are and what time period you're living in, and if you're a Kabbalistic writer or you're a writer, a Parshan living in the Middle Ages, the allegory takes on different forms. For example, Ibn Ezra has a fascinating commentary on Shir Hashirim, and he has a 4-tier commentary. Okay, he has a Pshat commentary, has a Midrash commentary, he has a more Kabbalistic commentary, and then he has another Midrashic commentary, which he sort of, talking about plot versus individual psukim, he looks at all of Shir Hashirim as a love triangle. It's a love triangle between the woman, the man, and there's another man. Who is the other man? The king. Okay, and he's sort of the backdrop, and there's constantly this competition between the two men for the woman's attention. Okay, and it's reflecting her lack of confidence, and she's not sure who she should be with, and he sort of sketches out literally a plot that sits in the backdrop of Shir Hashirim. And it's not in every single pasuk, but he said that's the prism through which we understand Shir Hashirim. And there's just a myriad amount of different ideas that are expressed in different commentaries throughout the ages. But Rashi's commentary is fascinating. And it's fascinating also because Rashi, as we know, he doesn't write many methodological statements throughout his commentary. He writes one in the beginning of the Torah. He writes one a little bit later in Sefer Bereshit, and the other sort of methodological commentary about how he understands the relationship between Pshat and Midrash is only here in Shir Hashirim, and it's an interesting place to put it. It also makes sense because it's a book that really sort of hangs out in the spectrum between Midrash and Pshat. I'm gonna move this so you could see. I'll move the banner. Is it under more? I've minimized the boxes, the faces.
Oh, you did that already.
Yeah, okay. I minimize. Yeah, that I have, but it's this banner. I did do Zoom for a year last year. We're such good friends named Zoom. I did a whole degree on Zoom. We were on Zoom before Zoom was before Corona. Thank God. I did all the Yotzot Halacha on Zoom. Not an experience I would want to repeat. Not the Yotzot Halacha, the Zoom part. Okay, so he starts off Achad Dvar Elohim, Shtayim Zo Shamati. Okay, mostly we see it. מקרא אחד יוצא לכמה טעמים, בסוף דבר אין לך מקרא יוצא מידי פשוטו ומשמעו. Now this is a little bit less important to us because we're not in the class about relationship between Pshat and Midrash in the commentaries, but he opens up with this idea that ultimately there are many ways to interpret a pasuk. However, every pasuk has its own pshat. It has its own simple sense. Again, how this fits in with Rashi's actual commentary is a different question I'm happy to address after class. And he says, and even though the prophets speak in metaphor, צריך ליישב הדוגמה על אופנה ועל סדרה, כמו שהמקראות סדורים זה אחר זה. He says, and even when they speak in metaphor, they speak in more homiletic language, it needs to be understood for its basic simple sense. There's a lot of academic commentary on how to understand that actual paragraph, but I just gave you one version. ואני אומר, and here's how he explains, how does he look at שיר השירים? שראה שלמה ברוח הקודש, שעתידין ישראל לגלות גולה אחר גולה, חורבן אחר חורבן, ולהתאונן בגלות זו על כבודם הראשון. And he says that Shlomo HaMelech, sticking with the Mesorah, that Shlomo was the writer of Shir Hashirim, that he was able to foresee the future. And he saw that in the future, Am Yisrael would go into galut. They would be exiled after exile, in this case, 2 exiles, and that they would pine for, they would yearn for their initial honor, right? Their initial relationship with God, that they were a people who had a temple, who had a relationship, established relationship with God. Then they would be sent out into galut, and they would be really sullied and lost and torn, but they would want to remember what life was once like. They would want to go back and look at that album, right? About, oh, how nice, how cute we were when we were little. And ולזכור חיבה ראשונה אשר היו סגולה מכל העמים. וייסד הספר הזה ברוח הקודש, בלשון אישה צרורה אלמנות חיות. משתוקקת על בעלה, מתרפקת על דודה, מזכרת אהבת נעוריה אליו. Okay, here's obviously the paraphrasing from Yirmiyahu. And he says that what is it? How is Shlomo writing? He said it looks like it's a young woman. Okay, it is a young woman. He says, but it's being told much later on, retroactive. I mean, the story of how we met and fell in love is told retroactively by an older woman who is a widow who has been left alone. The phrase amanut chayut is a very powerful phrase because it's kind of parallel to what we today will call an aguna, but it's a woman whose husband is not with her. How do I properly define it? I feel like you can define this better than I can. No, meaning he's using it in the Talmudic sense that that she is a woman who is been left alone, but her husband is still alive. We'll define it as that, and I'll explain why Rashi is saying this in a minute. And she's yearning for her husband. And she's recollecting on the love that she had when she was younger. Now, why am I bringing this to you? Because Rashi's commentary here is fascinating. Everybody understands it as being in direct dialogue with the very difficult Christian surrounding that he's living in. That this is a direct dialogue with the fact that Rashi's living in a time where the Christians living during that period are clearly saying, you've been rejected. God doesn't want you. You guys are lost. You have no land. You have no central authority or centralized yeshut. You're not a centralized entity. And so Rashi is saying, Shir Shirim, it's not necessarily that Shlomo, he says Shlomo prophesies, right? And he saw that this will be in the future. But even if you take that part out, he's saying that I want my generation to understand Shir Shirim as being a comforting love song, right? When he takes Shlomo out and put Rashi there, Rashi is saying, I want to comment on Shir Shirim so that people will use it as a comfort that God loves us. All right. Again, assuming the metaphor here is the assumption, the allegory, that God loves us. God is here with us, and God, even if we don't feel him right now, we don't feel chosen at this moment in time, but God certainly chose us way back when. And so he looks at Shir Shirim as sort of this, imagine the first year of marriage Shutterfly album. Okay, that's what that Shir Shirim is. It's remembering that early stage of our relationship when we were falling in love with each other. And things were much more perfect than they are now. And so Rashi, while most of his commentary, he does explain pshat understanding of the psukim, but he brings in the allegory all throughout his commentary. But he says that that's the prism. So it doesn't necessarily impact the direct commentary in each pasuk, but that's the overall plot line that he uses to understand Shir Shirim. And most understand this commentary of Rashi as meant to be a comfort for the people of his generation. And he's writing the commentary specifically looking at not what really is the pshat of the psukim, but specifically wanting to comfort the people around him. Okay, and so we'll bring in Rashi also here and there. I think we'll stop for today because I don't want to go over time. But I'm happy to take any questions. And anybody who's on Zoom, I'm going to stop the share. Anybody who's on Zoom and wants to ask questions, please feel free to unmute and do so.
I would like to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm just putting the volume up. Hold on. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we totally hear you.
Okay. Did Shlomo HaMelech write all the Shirim? All the Psalms?
Look, the Chazal say that Shlomo wrote Shir HaShirim. The book itself doesn't necessarily, it can't attest to that or not attest to it, but that's the Mesorah that we have from Chazal. I personally don't think it matters. I don't think it makes that much of a difference in how we understand the book.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah, Gitzel. I'm going to take a question from the crowd and I'll repeat it in the microphone. Yeah.
The material that you have on the screen, do we have access to that?
I'm sure, but do you want a sheet also? Meaning, is it easier for you to have a sheet instead of looking here?
Yeah.
Sheet. Okay, so next time I'll bring a sheet.
It's just easier if you want to review it.
Correct. Okay, so I'll bring a sheet next time that also has the sources from this week, so you'll have them. Okay.
Thanks.
Pleasure. Yeah. Remind me your name though.
Chaya.
Chaya.
I have a question, like, I guess overall, share, like,
it definitely is a love poem, but like, it's not like the most ideal, like, I mean, there's.
Not, it's not at all an ideal love poem. I wouldn't necessarily want to be in that relationship. Yeah.
I know, I was thinking that, but there are some parts that are really nice, but there are also a lot of parts that are really sad, and like, I feel like when Rambam says like that, like, Shir is about like what our love is, it's like, I don't know, I don't like look at this and think like, oh, that's the ideal form of love.
Yeah.
So like.
The question here by Chaya is that Shir Shirim doesn't, it's not necessarily a love poem that we personally would want to jump into. There's a lot of low points and miscommunications and them constantly missing each other. That's like the main theme, that they're like never on the same page. So I agree with you that I don't think I think that the Rambam is looking at it like very globally. I don't like, he's looking at certain psukim, which present something very all encompassing. But I agree with you that when you look deeper into each of the psukim, it's not necessarily an idyllic situation, which is why I personally like looking at the pshat of it, because I think that the lack of idealism teaches us a lot about the reality of relationships. So that's where I head more, and it'll show up in the shirim as well. I look at those places the most of what to learn from. I think that they reflect very real, vulnerable parts of how people behave in their love relationships. But I agree with you that it's not presenting a completely idyllic picture. But that's why I like it. I agree with you. Any other questions? Does someone here have a question and on Zoom? No. Okay, everybody have a Shabbat Shalom.
I was just gonna ask if you could present the sheets ahead of time, or today's sheets.
Well, I was trying to stick just with PowerPoint, but there's a request for sheets, so I'll go back to sheets and PowerPoints, and then you'll have the sheets before class, okay? And I'll put on the sheets for next week the sources that I use this week.
But you can't get those out today, the sources you used?
I could. I can send it now. No problem. I'll send it to the office in the next half hour, okay?
Thanks so much.
My pleasure. I don't know if I could leave or needs to stay open. Okay, I will smooth out the technical issues for next time.